It's 11 a.m., so let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's FEMA Region 3 Coffee Break webinar, Increasing Resilience Through Land Use Planning and Building Codes. Today, each of our presenters are going to explore how land use planning and building codes can greatly reduce the risks of natural hazards. Here we have our technology tour slide, which will help us navigate the Zoom platform during this webinar. All participants on the call are currently on mute. This will help to reduce background noise since there are so many of us on the call. You may use the chat panel to ask questions. If we have time at the end of the webinar, we will keep the chat open for any additional comments or questions that come through. Should we not get the chance to respond to your question, you can reach out to our presenters via email. Their contact information will be provided at the end of the webinar. When it comes time for polling questions, they should pop up for you to easily answer. If you are experiencing a lot of technical difficulties using the polling function, please type your response to the poll in the chat. To be eligible for professional accreditation, you must respond to these polling questions and attend the webinar in its entirety. This coffee break webinar is being recorded, and I will talk more about that on the next slide. So as I mentioned, this webinar will be recorded. The recording may be used for future reference to share with people who could not attend this coffee break. It may also be used otherwise at FEMA's discretion. By attending this webinar, you agree to these conditions. The webinar recording and a copy of the PowerPoint slides will be shared with all Eventbrite registrants and webinar attendees after the coffee break ends. So again, welcome to today's coffee break webinar, Increasing Resilience Through Land Use Planning and Building Codes. It's so fun to see in the chat, where everyone is calling in from. So yeah, please keep letting us know. And we have an exciting agenda lined up for you all today. So Lorena Reyes with FEMA Region 3 will begin by providing an overview of how effective land use tools and building codes can increase resilience. Jonathan Westcott with FEMA's Building Sciences will provide an overview of national and FEMA building code initiatives. Josh Lippert with FEMA Region 3 will expand on the opportunities and challenges to advancing building codes. Brian Lennon with the City of Wilmington, Delaware will tell us all about an innovative South Wilmington Wetland Park project and how effective land use planning greatly reduced the community's risks to natural hazards. Finally, we'll wrap up with relevant resources, announcing future coffee break webinar topics, provide information about how you can receive professional credits for attending this webinar in its entirety, and have a Q&A. So our first presenter and the FEMA lead for this webinar is Lorena Reyes. Lorena has experience supporting Illinois, Michigan, and Texas with local hazard mitigation planning and implementation. She has experience working in emergency management at the federal, state, and local levels, supporting communities before, during, and after disasters. A native Texan, Lorena graduated with a BA in public administration from the University of Texas in San Antonio, and later earned her MA in public policy from the University of Chicago. And with that, I will pass it off to Lorena.
Thank you, Alyssa. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's coffee break webinar. As Alyssa mentioned, we will be discussing increasing resilience through land use planning and building codes. As we continue to face challenges of climate change, it is more important than ever that we take steps to increase the resilience of our communities. By carefully planning the way that we use our land, we can create communities that are better able to withstand the impacts of extreme weather events. This can include things like preserving natural habitats and green spaces, which can act as buffers against flooding and erosion. Or we can guide future growth away from areas with known hazards. Land use planning involves the input and participation of a variety of stakeholders, including you all, whether you're a community member, a government official, or a developer. There are several different tools used in land use planning, such as zoning, comprehensive planning, and smart growth strategies. The goal of land use planning is to create a sustainable and livable community for all residents. It also provides a context for building codes. By requiring that new buildings be constructed to meet certain standards, we can help to ensure that our communities are better able to withstand natural disasters. This can include things like mandating the use of more resilient building materials or requiring that buildings be designed to better withstand high winds and heavy rain. I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker, who will actually go more in depth into what building codes are and why they're important. Jonathan Westcott is a civil engineer with FEMA Building Science Branch. Jonathan has been with FEMA's Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration since 2006. He is responsible for the development of technical policy, standards, and guidance on building science and building codes issues, and he led FEMA's Building Code Safe Study. He is currently focused on implementing the agency's building code strategy to advance the adoption and enforcement of hazard-resistant building codes and standards for FEMA programs. Thank you for joining us, Jonathan.
Thank you, Lorena. I'm happy to be here, and that was a very nice introduction. I'm also a native of Region 3, born and raised in Pennsylvania in Lancaster County, so I'm real happy to be here supporting the region. And I'm going to be talking about building codes and hopefully give you some perspective on why you've been hearing so much about building codes lately. Many of you may be aware that FEMA has been a leader in the development and implementation of hazard-resistant building codes and standards for over 30 years. We've learned a lot from disasters and have used that knowledge to strengthen the nation's model building codes so that buildings constructed to today's codes experience fewer losses. And that's an outcome that our mitigation assessment teams have documented and measured in the field following recent disasters. We've also studied the benefits of building code adoption. As was mentioned in the intro, our Building Code Save study showed that communities adopting and enforcing modern building codes have already saved our nation at least $32 billion in losses from natural hazards since 2000. And we determined that if even more communities adopted and enforced building codes, that savings could increase to $132 billion by 2040. We're not the only ones who've studied building codes. The National Institute of Building Sciences Hazard Mitigation Save study, which is very frequently cited and you've probably heard of, also looked at the benefits of building codes. They found that new buildings designed above the 2015 model codes would prevent 32,000 non-fatal injuries, 100 cases of post-traumatic stress disorder, and 20 deaths each year. And newer editions of the model building codes include even more hazard-resistant provisions that further reduce damages and death. That same study is the one that identified the very impressive 11-to-1 return on investment for communities adopting the latest building codes, and a 4-to-1 return on adopting above code requirements. Their study also found that incorporating hazard-resistant building practices only increased the cost of construction by about 1 to 2% on average. So the benefits of strong building codes have been demonstrated. And our success with hazard-resistant building codes and our advocacy for them has also resulted in action at the White House. If you could go to the next slide, please. On June 1st of last year of 2022, FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell and the Deputy National Climate Advisor Ali Zaidi, along with other partners from IBHS and other groups, announced the launch of the National Initiative to Advance Building Codes at the Florida International University Wall of Wind in Miami, Florida, which is shown here on the slide. The National Initiative to Advance Building Codes will better align federal programs with modern building codes and help state, local, tribal, and territorial governments in their efforts to adopt the latest building codes and standards. This will enable communities to be more resilient to hurricanes, flooding, windstorms, wildfire, and other extreme weather events that are intensifying due to climate change, while also saving families money on utility bills through improved energy efficiency. The White House's National Climate Task Force has directed federal agencies to implement actions that support the following priorities. There's 4 of them. One is to comprehensively review federal funding and financing of building construction to incorporate the latest consensus-based codes. Also, to harness the $225 million available in infrastructure funding for the Department of Energy to support implementation of updated building energy codes and create good quality jobs. To increase incentives and support communities to adopt and enforce current building codes and standards by providing technical assistance, enhanced outreach, and capacity building. And finally, to lead by example across the federal building portfolio by seizing opportunities and expanding efforts to advance ambitious above code resilience and energy efficiency standards in new projects across the federal building portfolio. From these 4 priorities, it's really clear that FEMA has a major role in implementing the national initiative to advance building codes. But we're also working with other federal agencies like the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, Housing and Urban Development, and others, as we've been directed to by the White House. If you could go to the next slide, please. So what is FEMA doing to better capitalize on the benefits of building codes and implement the national initiatives to advance building codes? Well, FEMA developed its own building code strategy to coordinate and prioritize our activities to advance the adoption and enforcement of natural hazard resistant building codes for FEMA's programs and communities nationwide. The 3 goals of the strategy are shown here, and I'm going to give some examples that illustrate each goal. Goal 1 is to integrate building codes and standards across FEMA. For many of our stakeholders, this is evident in our grant programs, which are increasingly relying on building codes. But it's not always about construction or rebuilding, and the integration of codes and standards looks different across different programs. One notable example of Goal 1 is how our mitigation planning program is embracing building codes. Where we build and how we build is critical to reducing losses. And the new local mitigation planning policy guide encourages the adoption and enforcement of hazard-resistant building codes. It directs planners to address building codes and the impacts of old or weakened codes during their capability assessment. The updated guide also encourages participation from the local agency or department that regulates building codes directly in the planning process. These changes will help code officials be a part of the broader community resilience discussion, enable them to better tap into mitigation grant programs, and help them gain broad support for building code improvements. Many of these updates are mirrored across the newly updated state mitigation planning policy guide and become requirements for enhanced state mitigation plans. And this is just one example of how we are integrating building codes across FEMA, and it's a trend that we aim to continue. Goal 2 is to strengthen nationwide capability for superior building performance. Again, there's a lot of examples of how we are doing this, both internally within the agency and in the states and communities that we serve. Examples of Goal 2 include many of our grant programs, like the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or BRIC program, and the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, or HMGP, which provide funding and resources for building code improvements. Public assistance also funds building code administration following a disaster, since the best time for local communities to enforce disaster-resistant building codes is during recovery. FEMA is also increasing its own building code expertise, and we're currently hiring at headquarters and across all 10 regions. Region 3 is in the process of hiring its regional building code coordination specialist position, so we look forward to more coordination on building codes in the coming years. Lastly, Goal 3 is to drive public action on building codes. And our success in this goal is really illustrated, one, by the historic funding levels provided by the administration for mitigation, but also by some of our partner activities. Many of FEMA's hazard mitigation assistance grant programs have seen significant increases in funding in recent years, especially under the bipartisan infrastructure law. Funding for BRIC was doubled, and the flood mitigation assistance program is seeing a five-fold increase. FEMA's building code strategy will ensure that the agency leverages this historic funding to advance building codes, among many other priorities. We also know that driving public action takes more than just federal efforts, which is why we're excited to have great partners who are also working to advocate for stronger codes, seek funding opportunities, and promote building safety practices across the public and private sectors. If you could go to the next slide, please. For example, we work closely with the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes, or FLASH, on their No Code, No Confidence campaign to raise public awareness of building codes. Their website at www.inspecttoprotect.org is an excellent resource for the public to learn if their community has adopted a current building code. In developing the campaign, FLASH conducted research and focus groups to get a better understanding of the public's understanding and perceptions on building codes. They found that overwhelmingly, the public believes that building codes are important. They also assume that they're covered by strong modern building codes, even when in some cases they may not be. These and other findings led FLASH to develop a tool, inspecttoprotect.org, for the public specifically to raise awareness of what building codes are adopted in their community. The launch of the No Code, No Confidence campaign and the inspecttoprotect.org tool was accompanied by a series of short, entertaining, and thought-provoking videos starring weather personalities that can be viewed at the website. So I would ask everyone, do you know what building code is adopted in your community? And if you're not sure, or you don't know, or even if you think you do know, I would ask you to head over to inspecttoprotect.org to find out. So in closing, the building code strategy and its accompanying implementation plan establish a path forward for the agency to speak with mutual understanding around building codes, to act more cohesively around their inclusion in our programs, and to prioritize them to increase resilience, protect communities, and save lives. But we cannot execute these efforts in a vacuum, and success requires consistent engagement and support across our programs and throughout our regions, like Region 3. So I thank you for this opportunity today, and I'll turn it back over to Alyssa for our next presenter.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I see there are quite a few questions in the chat. For everyone that is putting their questions in chat, we appreciate it. We will get to that during the Q&A at the end of all of the presentations. Thank you. And with that, I will introduce our next speaker, Josh Lippard. Josh is a certified floodplain manager, CFM, through the Association of State Floodplain Managers, ASFPM, and currently works for the FEMA Region 3 as a floodplain manager section supervisor. With nearly 10 years of experience in floodplain management, Josh has worked as a floodplain administrator for the city of Pittsburgh and the city of Philadelphia. His background and education is in landscape architecture and environmental planning, graduating from the Pennsylvania State University with a bachelor's of landscape architecture. Thank you for joining us, Josh.
Good morning, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about some opportunities and challenges for building code integration for floodplain management, specifically for communities that participate in a national flood insurance program, which have the requirement to adopt regulations and enforce floodplain regulations for all development in the special flood hazard area. So this first slide really just gets into the breadth of building codes that exist out there. There are national codes and standards, and then each state can have their own regulations and requirements regarding a variety of codes for roads, bridges, water, and sewer facilities. The International Code Council, specifically talking about the IRC, the International Residential Code, or the IBC, the International Building Code, or even the IEBC, the International Existing Building Code, are a few of the most prominent international codes that we adopt at the state level and then at the local level, with the caveat that at the local level, some states do allow local communities to amend the international building codes for local adoption. In addition to these, I just wanted to highlight a few others as we talk about building codes and their integration into floodplain management. That being ASCE 2414, that's the American Society of Civil Engineers, standard 2014. It's the flood resistant design and construction standard. In my opinion, it's one of the gold standards in terms of adoption of building codes for floodplain management purposes, as it gets into very specific typologies, whether it's coastal zones or swimming pools or elevators. It talks very specifically about each of those scenarios within the building code. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of advantages and challenges in code adoption and coordination. Here in Region 3 specifically, we highly prioritize the adoption of standalone floodplain ordinances. Each of our states here in Region 3, including the District of Columbia, have adopted a state model ordinance that then is locally adopted by participating national flood insurance communities. However, that alone may not be the strongest way to enforce floodplain regulations. So we strongly encourage not only the adoption of a standalone floodplain ordinance that may even be integrated into your zoning code, but adoption of floodplain provisions additionally in your building codes, which can then be a force multiplier in the way that you implement your floodplain management regulations, being that you would be implementing them both in your floodplain ordinance, but also through the floodplain provisions adopted, say, through the I codes, be it the IRC, the IEBC, the IBC, or even ASCE 2414. Together, these can be a force multiplier. They can strengthen enforcement. So not only would you have enforcement by the floodplain administrator who is administrating your floodplain ordinance, you'd also have the building code official that may be in a different department administrating floodplain provisions, both through permitting and inspection. So you'd have multiple sets of eyes and checks and balances on development occurring in the special flood hazard area. And then ultimately, building codes, they're updated every 3 years. So right now, the most recent international building code is 2021, but many of our states here in Region 3 are still on the 2018. So every 3 years, we've learned from disasters that have struck, whether it's hurricanes, earthquakes, and those lessons learned are built into the new building code series every 3 years. Unlike our floodplain model ordinances, that are typically only adopted during new map updates, which can be every decade or so, if not longer. So building codes, again, can add a strengthened enforcement mechanism for any sort of development in the special flood hazard area. Next slide. However, there are some challenges with the coordination of building codes. As I said, floodplain administrators may be really knowledgeable about floodplain ordinances and the zoning code for floodplain regulations. However, they might not work in the same office or department as their colleagues in the building permit department. They may not even be aware of what current building code series they're on, whether it's the 2009, the 2015, the 2018, or the 2021. So one of the major challenges is that code coordination, making sure that the floodplain administrators are working closely with the building official. In a lot of cases, building officials, they just think that the floodplain administrator is reviewing for all floodplain development. So they disregard the floodplain provisions in the building code. So it's vitally important to forge those relationships. Otherwise, you will not have that coordinated code and enforcement of locally adopted codes, both for floodplain management in an ordinance and in building codes. Another challenge is that there are some code conflicts. So building codes, as I said, are updated every 3 years, whereas floodplain ordinances are typically not. So building codes can have a lot of higher standards that may be in conflict with existing floodplain regulations in your floodplain ordinance. So it's important to understand those conflicts in those ordinances. And make sure that you may even create a crosswalk between your floodplain ordinance and your building codes to tease out those challenges, to make the applicants aware of where there are higher standards in the various codes that you've adopted for floodplain management. Next slide. Communication is key here. So the who, the what, the when, the where, and the how. It's important to work across departments, collaboration. It might not even just be departments. You might have third-party contractors doing inspections or plan reviews or enforcement of your building codes. So it's vitally important to communicate and understand what codes you've adopted. Again, floodplain ordinances are the go-to for floodplain management generally. However, the building codes have those floodplain provisions built in, and as I stated, those are updated every 3 years. So understanding what I-code provisions you're on. Are you, again, on that 2018, or are you on the latest and greatest, the 2021 I-code provisions? And have you even taken it a step further and adopted things like Appendix G of the IBC or that ASC 2414 that I stated earlier, that is even more in depth with flood-resistant construction standards. Next slide. And then in closing, it's just important to understand that, again, it can be a force multiplier when you have adopted both floodplain ordinances and building codes. You can use them in tandem. You can use the higher standards that are adopted in the building codes to really reinforce the requirement for NFIP participating communities to permit and inspect all development in the special flood hazard area. And those together can actually greatly increase resiliency. As we all know, the NFIP regulations, the 44 CFR, have not been updated for decades. But as stated in this presentation, building codes are updated every 3 years. So it's a great opportunity to increase resiliency for new construction, existing construction, alterations, renovations of any properties, structures, buildings, swimming pools, accessory structures in the special flood hazard area. Thank you, Lorena.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Jonathan, for presenting on national and FEMA building code initiatives and the opportunities and challenges to advance building codes. Now we're going to pivot and going to hear from Brian Lennon, the Water Division Assistant Director with the City of Wilmington, about how effective land use planning greatly reduced a community's risk to natural hazards. It is my pleasure to introduce Brian. Brian has 23 years of experience in the field of water and wastewater engineering and has worked in both the public and private sector of the water and wastewater industry. This includes 10 years of experience managing the wastewater and stormwater collection system of the City of Wilmington Department of Public Works Water Division. Brian has managed capital projects with a total value of over $60 million and provided oversight of operating budgets and operating contracts with the annual budgets of over 20 million. And I see that I jumped the gun a little bit. Sorry, Alyssa. Before we hear from Brian, let's go ahead and complete the poll that is on your screen. And we'll give it a few minutes. And then we will hear a great presentation from Brian.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lorena. Yeah, I'm excited to hear Brian's presentation. First, we do have our poll, and answering this is crucial to getting CFM or AICP credits if you are joining and hoping to get those. So please respond to our poll. What are some benefits of effective building codes? Please respond to the poll, but if you're having difficulty doing that, you can feel free to put your response in the chat. And if you have another benefit example, please let us know. I also am taking note of everyone's questions in the chat, and we will revisit those at the end of the webinar. We have allotted some time for Q&A, so thank you so much for submitting those questions. right, well, it looks like most folks have responded to the poll. Maybe we can go ahead and end that. And yep, Lorena, it looks like most folks responded E, all of the above.
Awesome. All right. Here we go. Thank you all so much for participating in the poll question. Now back to our amazing presentations. We will hear from Brian Lennon. Brian, if you're ready.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to present, and thank you to Lorena and Alyssa for helping me with this presentation. My goal is to get to the end of the presentation on our coffee break presentation and have your coffee still be warm. My original version, your coffee would have been ice cold by the end. So next slide. So City of Wilmington's in northern Delaware, and it is a typical, mid-Atlantic city, urban area with city has a population of about 70,000 and is the largest city in Delaware. And like most urban areas, with rising temperature, we're vulnerable to heat island effects in the city. There's a lot of impervious area in the city, and as I've been in my job and working with all the staff that I have, I've come to discover that economic justice communities are particularly impacted by the heat island effects because they typically occur in areas that have low tree cover and low access to green space. Additionally, the city of Wilmington is a coastal city. It's the Brandywine and Christina rivers are tidal rivers that kind of wrap through city of Wilmington. The mean high tide in Wilmington is about 4 feet. And in the area of South Wilmington, where we'll talk a little bit about in our Southbridge wetlands project area, there's low elevations of 4.5 to 5 feet above sea level. So we have particular problems with flooding in these areas. Additionally, City of Wilmington is also a CSO community, a combined sewer collection system community. 90% of our area, the same pipes that collect stormwater also collect our sewer flow, and we have sewer overflows that are triggered anywhere between 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch of rainfall. And as storm intensities increase, which we have observed that, it causes more increased, more frequent overflows. Next slide. So what are we doing to prepare? We have a project that we'll present a video on a little bit later here on our Southbridge Wilmington Wetland project. And that project is a great project and we're very proud of it. But as we got that project going, I realized that we also need to address flooding in Wilmington as an entire area and the resiliency of Wilmington as a whole community, and not just focus on that one project, which you'll see is a really great project, but it's kind of, I didn't want that project to suck all the oxygen out of the room. So we partnered with the state of Delaware, Department of Environment, DENREC, and received an $80,000 grant with a $20,000 match to prepare a resiliency and sustainability plan for Wilmington to expand the efforts beyond the project that we're going to learn about later. And as part of that resiliency effort, it expanded our engagement in the community with a number of workshops. As part of doing this plan, I got out of my cubicle here in Public Works and engaged with multiple departments across the city. And additionally, coming out of the recommendations of the plan, we're establishing a working group to address these kind of issues that we heard about on the presentation just before, about coordinating with multiple departments and making sure the efforts of the public works are coordinating with the land use and planning, so that we're all implementing resilient practices. And then one of the final recommendations out of that was to apply for DEMA and FEMA funding to address some of the challenges that were identified as part of our evaluation in resilient Wilmington. And I'll talk about that in one of the future slides here. Next slide. Our resilient Wilmington plan, as we had described earlier, included recommendations and input from multiple departments, including, waterfront development, transportation, public health and safety, and of course, my favorite department, the sewer and stormwater department. And so we're going to focus a little bit on the recommendations that came out of our department here. Next slide. So the recommendations that were coming out of there were to continue to expand education and outreach. And one of the things I've discovered as part of this process, as we were implementing this plan and applying for funding through FEMA and other entities, is that community outreach is a key element to having a competitive grant application. And so, the team that we assembled was very proactive in advocating for expanded outreach to our community. And we've done that as part of our South Wilmington Wetlands project, as well as some of our other projects. The additional recommendations were to integrate resiliency into future projects. And you'll see that the project that we'll watch the video on integrates resiliency into that project in multiple ways, bringing green space into an economic justice community. Another example of that is we're doing this green stormwater management project at an outdoor event space for urban arts, where they're installing an amphitheater and we're installing green infrastructure to manage stormwater in the outdoor event space. So we're able to offset some of their costs for their project, but at the same time, we're getting better stormwater management incorporated into the space and making stormwater management upfront to the community. And then finally, one of the recommendations coming out of that report was to pursue some funding with DEMA, Delaware Emergency Management Agency, and FEMA for resiliency, shoreline resiliency. The project that we're going to hear about addresses one mechanism of flooding, but shoreline flooding is not one of the mechanisms that it addresses. So we applied for 2 separate BRIC grants that were helping us to assess the risk to the shoreline communities in Wilmington, evaluate the alternatives, estimate the cost of those alternatives, and ultimately get us to a point where we can calculate a benefit cost ratio, so that not only are we doing our planning grant, but we're setting ourselves up to apply in a competitive way for an implementation grant, or decide whether that project really, the purpose of that benefit cost ratio is really to decide whether that project has enough substance and merit that it would be competitive. Next slide. So before we play the video, this is about our Southbridge Wilmington Wetlands project. And I just want to quickly touch on the goals of the project, and which may not come out as clear story here, but this project is a multi-million-dollar project that's designed to reduce flooding to an environmental justice community. It's going to restore a dysfunctional wetland, or it already has, I should say. It will also remediate a brownfield in this economic justice community, provide access of the community to green space by creating a park for them to interface with the wetland. And it's going to reduce stormwater sewer overflows to the river, thereby cleaning up the river. It will also clean the stormwater that we separate out from our CSO system before we discharge it to the rivers. So using very environmentally friendly practices for managing stormwater. And hopefully in the end, it'll also reduce the mosquito habitat to the community by eliminating areas of stagnant water and promoting a healthy ecosystem with competitive species to feed on the mosquito larvae that are in the area. And this will hopefully buy us time to do some work to implement additional measures for flooding and protecting the community, as well as spur on development in the area of the park. And with that, I will turn it over to Melissa for the video.
There wasn't much interest in any kind of economic development over here because you never know when you was going to be flooded. 50 years Southbridge has been dealing with flooding. 50. You know how people say that things are held together literally by shoestrings? We had floodgates really hanging open by rope.
Honestly, when I first started on the project, I almost didn't think it could be done. We can't find a way to clean up a contaminated brownfield and turn it into a wetland. Who does that? Usually you put a parking lot over it and try to stop people from interacting, and instead we remediated it and allowed the wildlife and the natural ecosystem to live in what used to be contaminated soil.
It was such a degraded property in its early stages that it could not have been a healthy habitat for any wildlife.
NCRF is the National Coastal Resilience Fund, which is a grant program that we administer in partnership with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And we use that public funding that we get from our partners at NOAA and leverage that with corporate partner funding.
You know, this sort of dense, deep marsh is really what we're looking for. And if you were to have been here before we constructed the site, there was nothing for fish, nothing for any animals or birds. Like that really dense Phragmites, as far as you can see, there's just nothing growing in it. We now have all of this diversity.
You know, because we are the lowest level, when it would flood, it would go up to the window sills. This is part of the Wilmington housing development, of public housing. And here down that way, there were even more houses, and those have been torn down. I'm very proud of the city that they went as deep into actually trying to resolve what the issue is and to create a solution.
So we need a lower elevation, and that's what this wetland park is, and that's what it does. Instead of storing the stormwater in the streets and the parking lot, it allows us to store it here in the wetland. And in the process, we end up cleaning the stormwater before it's discharged out to the river, so it's an extra win.
In its first 5 years, the National Coastal Resilience Fund has been an incredible success. We've helped support over 140 million in investments in coastal communities across the US and supported projects like this, enhancing the livelihoods and quality of life for people and property, but also creating great habitat for fish and wildlife.
It's hard for me to quantify how this is going to be embraced, but I will tell you that the Southbridge Wetlands Project, it's something that's taken 25 or close to 30 years. This project tells the world what Wilmington's priorities are.
I would be remiss if I didn't note that, as you might have gathered, that this video was produced by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. They have provided about $3 million of funding towards the construction of that wetland park that was highlighted in the video. And we're very grateful to them for providing that funding. And they prepared this video to release with their announcement of new funding opportunities as an example of what can be accomplished with the funding that they're making available. And I think next slide, I think just has a couple of pictures of what the slide on the left is the gateway coming from the east in the community, where a lot of that video was taken with our community representative, and you're looking at the city of Wilmington in the background there. And one of the aspect of the park was a boardwalk that passes from the community to the east to the shopping opportunities to the west, and allows pedestrian access of the community to those areas, going over top of the channels in the wetland area. And that's about it.
Thank you, Brian. We got a lot of chatter on the video and your presentation, so I look forward to the Q&A after. But right now, we're going to do another poll question. So I hope that everyone can see it on their screen. If you can just take a minute to respond to the question. Again, we use these for those of you who are seeking any credits. I see some responses already in the chat. Alyssa, let me know when you will close it and we can continue with the webinar.
Sounds good. Thanks, Lorena. And I know on our previous poll question, some folks in the chat had some additional examples of responses that we could have used. So if you have any of those for this polling question, please feel free to put them in the chat too. So it looks like most folks have responded, and the top answer is all of the above. So thank you for responding. If you haven't done so, please do so now so that you can get your professional accreditation for this webinar. So we're going to close the poll.
Okay, go ahead, Alyssa.
Sorry, did you want to take this, Lorena?
No, you're fine.
Okay. So here we just have some resources that were described during the coffee break, the South Wilmington Wetland Park video that some folks asked for. I see some questions on professional credit. Yes, I will be sending a follow-up email with that information, as well as this recording and the PowerPoint presentation. And so, yes, we have all of our resources linked here, and you will get these after the coffee break. We have our upcoming FEMA Region 3 coffee break webinars planned out for 2023, which is really exciting. So in March, we have Discovering Mitigation Alternatives, and you can feel free to sign up for that on our Eventbrite page, and that will be linked on the next slide. So here are some sign-up links we wanted to include. Please stay tuned for some upcoming FEMA Region 3 coffee break webinars, and here is our Eventbrite page. You should also feel free to sign up for our FEMA Region 3 Resilience Report newsletter, which includes a lot of mitigation best practices and things happening in Region 3. And we love when folks submit article suggestions or things they would like to see highlighted in the Resilience Report newsletter. So please feel free to send any suggestions you might have to this email address. We also invite folks to join the Resilience Nation Partnership Network. They have a lot of really exciting and interesting webinars coming up, so you can feel free to sign up for those as well. So as I mentioned, you might be eligible for professional credits. By attending this presentation in its entirety and responding to the polls, you may be eligible for 1 Association of State Floodplain Managers, or ASFPM, Certified Floodplain Manager Continuing Education Credit, or 1 American Institute of Certified Planners, or AICP Certification Maintenance Credit. And then here's the course number linked to the page on APA's site. So here are our here is our presenter's contact information. We do have time for some questions around 10 minutes. I'll leave this up on the presentation in case folks want to jot down the email addresses. but maybe Lorena and the presenters, if it's okay, I'm just going to read through some of the questions that I received. So I think this one was for you, Jonathan. And the question is, this is some great information for new construction, but what about retrofitting existing buildings to get them up to speed?
Thank you. That is a great question, and existing buildings are our biggest risk, right? Because there's always going to be more existing buildings than stuff that we're building today. I would say that a couple of points to make. One, building codes do apply to new construction, but they also include triggers for substantial damage and substantial improvement, where certain where structures need to be brought into compliance with current codes, depending on how big of a change is being made, whether it's substantial improvement or substantial damage. And so so having a strong building code in place, then when those changes to buildings happen, they're upgraded to strong standards. So yeah, it applies to new construction, but in some cases it also applies to existing construction, and especially after disasters. In some cases there can be a lot of structures substantially damaged following disasters, and having a strong building code in place means that those structures will be brought into compliance with the strong building code. And then, under the NFIP, there's resources and whatnot to support that. We're also working with partners, though, to get at existing construction. We've had some meetings with NAHB, the National Association of Home Builders, and they have some resources to help encourage homeowners with low-cost retrofits and things like that. So there are some resources and some guidance available, and we're looking to amplify those resources. But I would say that having a strong building code in place is still an important aspect for existing construction as well.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce what Jonathan stated. I talked about floodplain ordinances versus building codes. Floodplain ordinances, especially in Region 3, tend to lack substantial damage information. Substantial damage may be defined, but in reality, the building code is where it's further elaborated on and identifies the building code official in that community as the person that is going to be issuing the substantial damage determinations for those existing structures that are damaged more than 50% of the market value. And I will further say some communities do adopt higher standards for substantial improvement and substantial damage that goes below that 50%. So some people do 20%, 30%, or cumulative can be adopted, but this is a place where the building code has the 50% as a standard. Thank you.
Thanks both. I think this next question would be geared toward you two as well. The question is, does FEMA send representatives to the meetings of code making organizations, for example, AASHTO? If not, what influence does FEMA have in the development, consideration, and adoption of codes and standards?
That's another great question. And yes, we do participate in codes and standards development with various codes and standards organizations. One of the big partners we have in this is the International Code Council, and they're the group that develops and maintains the international code series that are generally used as model building codes for most states and local communities. And these are the model codes that are updated every 3 years, as Josh mentioned. And we participate in the development process for every code cycle. So every 3 years, we are proposing changes to the codes that are based off of things that we've learned in the field and intended to increase the hazard resistance of model building codes. And we have a number of programs like the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program, which I know is not a big concern in Region 3, but they propose a lot of changes to seismic codes every cycle. And we also propose changes to flood and wind-related codes. We also participate in with the American Society of Civil Engineers in the development and updating of a couple of key ASCE standards, ASCE 7, ASCE 24, and ASCE 41, which are related to how buildings are designed, what kind of natural hazard provisions are incorporated, flood resistance and earthquake resistance. So, so yeah, and then also there's other ones as well. ASTM is developing a standard for flood damage resistant materials that we've been very supportive of over the years. So yes, we do participate in the development process where it makes sense for us to. In terms of adoption, that is a state and local function. And we do the best we can to inform stakeholders of the benefits of adopting model hazard resistant codes.
Yeah,
so
and just to elaborate on that. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
sorry, Jonathan.
Please. No, I was just wrapping up. Please go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, just elaborate that. So Jonathan works more at the national level, but here at Region 3, we work at the local state level. So we do work with state agencies that are adopting the latest and greatest building codes. So we were working in Pennsylvania, getting the 2018 adopted. I know Virginia is going through some adoption right now as well. So at the local level here at Region 3, we have floodplain specialists that are assigned to each state. And they work with those state partners and those departments within the state that are adopting codes at the state level. And then those usually are adopted at the local level as well in most of our states. Thank you.
Thank you both. So we have another question, and then maybe I can get to some questions for Brian. We just have a couple more minutes. So this question is, how can a building official learn more about what grant money is available? Are there examples of what qualifies that can be shared?
Absolutely. Under the BRIC, the Building Resilient Infrastructures and Communities grant program, we developed a fact sheet specifically for building code officials to help them understand what support is available and how building codes interact with that program. So that's certainly a resource that we can provide. You could also find it with a simple, internet search as well. It's on our FEMA.gov site. We also have our building codes adoption playbook, which was in the links that'll be distributed with the presentation, and that provides a lot of information on different grant opportunities available to building code officials. Totally get the question. We want to make sure that our resources are accessible to you, and so I'd be more than happy to get the resources that we've developed out to this group.
Thanks so much. And so, Brian, I guess we have a question for you that came in. So where did it go? So Brian, what is your perspective on the problems regarding combined sewer and stormwater systems in our older industrial cities?
Perspective on the effect on the combined systems? Well, for Wilmington, what we're finding is we're getting more increased and higher intensity storm events. So we're having a greater frequency of our overflows, and the volume of those overflows is higher. And then when you take that and interact it with a community like Wilmington, which has
Brian, it sounds like your audio is cutting out a little bit.
Outfall that's needed for an overflow actually for it causes more flooding upstream. And our resiliency report we did on how many more overflows we would have in manholes in the system as a result of sort of that backup from the river into the system. To have a sewer overflow to the river, but the actual it's better to have an overflow to the river than it is to have that sewer flow back up into the residences and the streets in the community. So it's not a desirable condition to have an overflow, but it's necessary. And now we're going to have more of them and more frequent. And because the outfall is higher, we may actually have more overflows back up into the system.
Awesome. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Brian. It looks like that leads us right to 12 o'clock. I know that we did not get the chance to respond to everyone's question in the chat. So you should please feel free to reach out to our presenters via email with your question, and they would be happy to respond if we did not get a chance to address it. And to request technical assistance from our FEMA Region 3 planners, you can also fill out this request form, which lives on FEMA.gov. Again, we'll be sending out this presentation, so you should have access to all of these links. Lorena, did you have any closing comments or anything you wanted to say before we wrapped up today?
I just want to say thank you again to the speakers for spending part of their day today with us. And thank you to all the participants for the great questions in the chat. And I hope everyone has a great day.